Hi everyone and welcome to something that I've been waiting to do for forever. I finally made it through all the games and media in the Castlevania series that were accessible to me. And I went through them very thoroughly and very carefully. I did a lot of research. I played all the games 100%. I played all the multiple endings if there were any. I read as deep as I could into them. And now I finally feel qualified enough to give my take on the entire series in perspective. However, I cannot compare entirely different things in the same ranking without relating to a certain criteria. I always see other people making tier lists and they say this is the best, this is the worst. Worst at what? You gotta give some sort of topic in order to make sense of the whole thing. Otherwise, what are you even ranking in the first place? Therefore, I decided to make 3 tier lists on different topics so that you get a better idea how the games compare in different aspects. And before you come crying, oh, where is Super Castlevania? I should maybe also mention that I only included actual main title that contribute to the timeline in some way or the other, be it canon or not, but if it's a retelling of a story that already happens in the timeline, I reserve that spot for the first game that came in that place. That simply means no remakes, no side tellings like Haunted Castle or something, no phone apps or whatever nonsense there is. I sorted all that out for you already, so it's only the core main games in the series, canon or not. However, I did actually include the 2 Netflix anime shows, just as a bonus for you to see how they might compare to the games. They can obviously not be judged the same way, I just included them to show them in perspective. But enough intro, let's get into the first of my rankings. And this one is ordered by the relevance for the series. This roughly means how much does the game contribute to the understanding and world building in the universe of Castlevania. I want to go from top to bottom here because I think it makes the most sense for the understanding if we start with the strongest point first and then work our way down to the rest. I'm also gonna reveal every row at once so we don't get caught up talking about each game forever, because it's more about the overall ranking and less about the review of the game itself. Even though I did rank them inside the row as well, so left is the higher position and right is the lower, but they're overall pretty similar in their importance. Anyway, here's the first row, and this should be very obvious. The entire series is based on and named after this very game, so I don't think it takes much to understand the importance of this title. Castlevania 1 is easily the most essential game in the series, and that's why I gave it the top spot for relevance here. So far so easy, but now we're gonna take a hard turn. Before you freak out, the next 2 rows are kinda meant to be like somewhat the same tier, but I have to give the edge over those titles that expand the world a little bit beyond just their own stories. So take a look at this. At first glance this just looks like I lost my mind, right? But you gotta think this through. Simon's Quest is a direct sequel to the first game, and you would never come to understand Simon better as a character if it wasn't for that game. And therefore the entire understanding of the first game changes because of the added information that the sequel provides. And therefore Simon's Quest has an impact on the experience of another game that goes beyond its own story. And needless to say, if you manage to impact the understanding of the first game that the entire series is based on, then that's a pretty big deal if you ask me. Very similar case for Harmony of Dissonance, which is kind of an epilogue to Simon's Quest in some way, but instead of the good side it basically shows the other side of the coin and explains more about the evil side of things in the series, and that's just another crucial aspect that gets barely touched upon in any of the other games. And for the value of this information for the series, I think Harmony of Dissonance deserves a spot this high up. I also put the second Netflix show Nocturne here, and if I tell you that the first season already features 3 Belmonts, then I hope you can see how this gives a unique perspective on the life and relationships of the characters. But there's a lot more in that show than just that. They also make a lot of real world connections and try to tie in the Castlevania universe to our real world universe, which by the way is a huge aspect in the original first game's idea. And I think that expands the whole horror factor of the series and makes it a more present topic. And that's obviously a relevant thing for a kind of forgotten series like Castlevania. And that's why I put Nocturne this high up here. Alright, so this was the hardest part. From now on it should go quicker. As I said earlier, this row is only slightly less relevant than the other. So all things mentioned here are an absolute must-see. Otherwise you have no chance to understand the full scope of the Castlevania series. So most important is Castlevania 3, followed by Belmont's Revenge. The one in the middle is Rondo of Blood, and we got even more blood with Bloodlines. And finally the first Netflix show that is based on Castlevania 3, and also provides some exclusive information that can only be found in that show. And here's pretty much where I draw the line in terms of relevance, because everything mentioned so far has unique information that enriches the universe of Castlevania, and everything that will follow from here is not really adding something valuable to the original concept of the series. And remember, we are not judging how good those games are. This has nothing to do with how good the material is. We are only after the information about the series that can be extracted from them. And those games listed here only tell a rather disconnected story to the established timeline, and therefore their importance to the series is rather small. But nonetheless, I would say they add somewhat to the overall understanding, so they're not completely ignorable for the series. In this row we got Castlevania 64 and its physical DLC, if you will. They tell a genius story in 2 parts that even exceeds the horror vibes of the very first game. However, it is structured entirely different and is also pretty much isolated from the rest of the series, and therefore it only helps to understand the world of Castlevania a bit better, but neither the story nor the understanding changes anything about the rest of the series. And therefore it hardly matters for the series itself if those games would not exist in the first place. Same goes for the rest of the line. Order of Ecclesia is just an independent story. Curse of Darkness is more like a side story and kind of an epilogue to Castlevania 3. It might be interesting for itself, but not really for the overall series. And lastly, we got Lament of Innocence. And I know what you're thinking, how can the origin story not be relevant for the series? And the answer is shockingly simple, because it's missing the point. They take details from the core series and kinda make a story around them and explain those details, but they totally forgot that the series is never about those details in the first place. So whatever they explain has little relevance and actually even works against the point of the original series. Stuff like the origin of Dracula or the origin of the Mystic Whip, those are key aspects in the series and they're never meant to be explained. The point of them is to be a mystery. That is what makes the thrill and the horror. The lack of knowledge makes them so mysterious and powerful in the first place. It is a holy and religious weapon that is only fueled by your belief. And if you take away the religious aspect of it, you basically just degrade it down to a normal tool that is like way less powerful. So in the end, you're basically taking away from the series by filling out essential blanks in the artwork, therefore destroying more than you add. But I thought I had to respect the attempt at least. I guess that's why it ended up this high on the list. But let's move on to the last bit. Down here we got Castlevania the Adventure. The only thing that it brings to the series is a new Belmont and a new saga, and that's pretty much it. So the existence of the game basically is the relevance, but there's nothing beyond that. As much as I would like for it to be more relevant, for the Castlevania series, its best contribution is to set up for the sequel. And lastly, we got Dracula X here. I know I said no remakes and no retellings, but this one is the only exception. It basically is a retelling of the Richter saga in a different way, and I personally like his depiction in Dracula X better, but I gotta admit that they lose too many details on the way, so Rondo of Blood in the end contributes way more to the series than Dracula X could. But on the flip side, it splits the attention between the two characters, Richter and Maria, but Dracula X shows a better spotlight on Richter, and therefore I think it is relevant to have this edition in the series. And that is it for the relevant titles. Everything else that pretends to be part of the franchise contributes absolutely nothing that is in line with the original idea of the series. Circle of the Moon is essentially Bloodlines at the core of its story, except it's way worse than a Metroidvania, so by default it has a disadvantage over an actual Vania, and if the story doesn't make up for it, then I don't think we need to investigate any further. Which brings me right to the next game. Symphony of the Night is a miserable little pile of a representation. It's another case of those games that are just a side story epilogue to another game, this one following Rondo of Blood, but it doesn't make any difference in the end, unlike some of the other games. It kinda ends the same way it starts, and the story itself basically proves that it has no relevance for the overall understanding. And aside from the story, the game doesn't even depict anything of any relevance to the series. You play as a cart of aluminum on an inside job that has nothing to do with nothing, so like, wow, how is that part of the series? My simple conclusion to that is, mankind ill needs a savior such as this. But enough talk, let's move on to Legends. This one is similar to Lament of Innocence in that it tries to tell an origin story, but other than just adding stuff to the existing story in order to make it richer, Legends actually takes the key parts of the formula and tries to retell them in a different way, and that just makes it a case of Haunted Castle basically, which didn't even make the list here, so why is this even here? It's simply because of the addition of a brand new character in Sonia Belmont, and the idea is at least inspiring, so I want to give it some credit for that. And with this we get to the end of the spectrum. The last 3 games listed here are just some anime nonsense that has nothing to do with Castlevania at all. And again, I just want to give the creative value some credit here, and that's the only reason why they even make the list. So if you ever seek understanding of the Castlevania series, then do not waste your time to confuse yourself with anything in this last line here. Those do not contribute notable value to the actual series. And with that we're done with the most objective list and therefore the most important one. The next is rather based on more personal perception. And this time we're gonna rank the titles by best experience. And that obviously comes down to the impressions and feelings that you get when you immerse yourself in a certain story. So what does best even mean in this case? Well, I tried to see it as the depth of the impression that the overall experience left on me, and also the helpfulness of the delivered message, mostly in relation to the series, and there are countless aspects that make the full picture in the end. So this list is roughly based on the general essence of a title. Therefore, it's only fitting that the 2 games with the best package of experience officially happen to also have the exact same name, which then even doubles down on the name of the series. I think that already gives you a little glimpse of their geniusness. Castlevania 1 and 64 obviously have their issues here and there, but the sum of all their parts together make for an incredibly rich and unreplaceable experience in the end, and that's why they both deserve the top spot in this list. The second row is about titles that have a really strong story but lack in some other aspects. And I'm talking mind-blowing story. Stunning deep presentations that you never get anywhere else. So for those 5 titles, you want to ignore the gameplay for now and just go by the weight of the story. Otherwise the Nocturne anime wouldn't even make sense here as it has no gameplay in the first place. But in terms of story depth, I would say those are the strongest titles in the series. And for the next row, we do quite the opposite. We measure by gameplay this time and not so much by the story. And you obviously want to keep the system of the games in mind and only compare the gameplay in relation to that. Otherwise it would be a bit unfair for the weaker machines. Either way, I think those games are amongst the best in the series when it comes to gameplay. The next row is kind of for the basic stuff, so it's not really crazy or anything, but it's not bad either. This is pretty much the most average experience you can get out of the series. Dracula X and the first Netflix anime, they both feel like some alternative depiction of a very basic experience. And honestly, for me, the list ends here. Next up is like the weird row. I would not touch those games if it wasn't for the information that they contain. But I can definitely see that some people might like the style and what they bring. So I would let those people have their fun and like be at peace with that. But for me personally, those games are already below the threshold that I would say they're still worth to play. And last row is like the definitive time waste. And who would have guessed they're all Metroidvania games. It's just a general mistake in the series. They should have never gone that route with the Metroidvania genre. It just doesn't fit the series and they're unable to deliver meaningful experiences just by the restrictions of that genre. It's unfortunate, but it happened, so we just gotta make the best out of it. At least I made it through them to make sure that I didn't miss out on any information or something. And now I can just pretend they never existed and instead play the worthy games again. But which games are even worth to replay? Let's find out with the last on my tier list, which is exactly about that question. And this is the list you've all been waiting for. And I obviously had to pick the only criteria that allows for this constellation. I think at this point you can already guess what's coming, but before we actually reveal it, let me try to clarify this category a bit better. When I say replay value, this can mean anything, so what kind of value are we looking for here? This is obviously very subjective and comes down to the person and their motivations, but I try to see it as the ability to put yourself through an experience again without it feeling too stale and therefore not worth to invest more time in it. So essentially the most value is the least staleness, and that is what this list is supposed to show. Alright, then let's finally reveal the first line already. And as you expected, the adventure is at the top spot here. That is not only because it's my most played game in the series, but there's actually a reason that makes it rank this high up. And it's simply because it's the only game in the series that is designed to be played over and over and over again without even having a real conclusion to it. And because it always leaves room for more and the level design is so genius that it still stays challenging even after multiple playthroughs, that is what puts this game above all in terms of its replay value. And speaking of genius, I think Castlevania 1 is best on its very first playthrough, but as a timeless classic you can obviously play it again and it's still great every time. And after that I put Castlevania 3 for all the different paths and characters that you have there. And the story already requires you to play the game at least 4 times over in order to see all the endings. And it's just a massive game and another timeless classic on the NES that hardly ever gets boring. And lastly, I put Bloodlines here as well, because it's pretty much designed like an arcade game with limited continues, and it's pretty challenging and has different characters. And I think that makes for a good replay value overall. And the fact that I myself, despite hating the gameplay and the physics, already made it 6 times through this game on hard mode, that is just a testament of how good the replay value of this title is, and therefore it deserves a spot in the highest tier. In the second row I put all the games that I think are definitely worth to play again, but those are pretty complex and a bit exhausting, and therefore I think they need more time to digest before you can properly take in that same experience again. But regardless of their delay, those games always give you a great time playing, and they barely lose any appeal in the long run. In the third tier I put all the titles that I think only exist for their information, and when you've checked them out once or twice, you're pretty much done with them for as long as your memory lasts. So even though their information might be very enriching, their replay value is naturally pretty low. But still not as low as the neglectable tier. Dracula X and Legends are pretty much a one and done thing at best, and it's highly unlikely that I would touch those games a second time. And right here is where my personal list concludes already. The rest is merely there for completion's sake. But don't get me wrong here, I can definitely see the second last line here be worth to be played multiple times, just not by me. And the same obviously goes for the spin-off games at the bottom. I'm fine if anyone replays them as much as they want, but they simply don't belong in this list in the first place. And with this, we finally made it to the very end of my 3 tier list, so congrats for sticking it out this long. I hope you got a better taste of my opinions about the series now. And if you think you have a better opinion, feel free to post it down in the comments. Obviously subscribe and like the video as always. And with that, thanks for watching and see you in the next video or stream. Goodbye.